Hello, welcome to another lecture on informal fallacies. Today we'll be talking about fallacies of unwarranted assumption. So, what are such fallacies? They assume the truth of some unproved or questionable claim. And if you're trying to establish a conclusion, you cannot assume some unproved or questionable claim in doing so. Although you might try to do it in order to sort of pull one over on someone where they don't see that you're assuming such claims, and then you're able to sort of trick them, I suppose, into accepting your claim because they can't see the unproved or questionable claim that's embedded within it. Okay, here's an example. I know I'm the best because no one is better. Well, you haven't actually given evidence that you're the best. You've simply restated that you're the best in a different way by saying no one is better. So this sort of reasoning is called circular reasoning. Here's another example. Do you still cheat on your taxes? Well, embedded within this question is an assumption that you ever cheated on your taxes in the first place. So you'd have to sort of parse out those assumptions, those questionable claims in the examples here, in order to see that there is an unwarranted assumption being made. So one example of an unwarranted assumption is begging the question. This is an argument that assumes in its premises the conclusion that it claims to be proving. For example, we know that the book of Fallacies is true. It was written by Prophet Jones. Prophet Jones wrote the truth because he was divinely inspired. He was divinely inspired because of the book of Fallacies says that he was, and everything it says is true. What's the conclusion of this argument? It is that we know the book of Fallacies is true. And then it looks like we're giving all this evidence that it's true. It was written by Prophet Jones. He wrote the truth because he was inspired. But you see that every single reason that's given to think that the book of Fallacies is true relies on the claim that everything it says it's true. So you're basically saying we know the book of Fallacies is true because everything it says is true, which is circular. You're not really providing any outside evidence that the conclusion is true. You're not providing any evidence outside of the conclusion itself for thinking that the conclusion is true, in spite of appearances, because you're listing all these other reasons, but then those other reasons ultimately depend on the truth of the conclusion itself. So we say this is begging the question. There's also a complex question. The fallacy occurs when a single question actually contains multiple parts and contains an unestablished hidden assumption. Another name for this is loaded question. So you might ask someone, is your child still obnoxious? Well, if you say no, you're admitting that your child was once obnoxious. If you say yes, you're admitting that your child once was obnoxious and still is. So either way, you're not going to win. So embedded within this question is two questions. Was your child ever obnoxious, and is your child still obnoxious? The only way this sort of question works as a non-fallacy is if the question is based on context. You've worked with your friend, you've talked with your friend knows that your child is obnoxious, and that's sort of background information. So your friend doesn't need to ask the question, was your child ever obnoxious, because that's been established in the friendship. So then your friend can rightly ask, is your child still obnoxious? But just to assume without any context that you can ask this question, that's another thing. You need to first establish that the child is obnoxious before you can ask, is your child still obnoxious? So that's why it's called a complex question, because it contains multiple questions within it, or a loaded question, which gives the connotation that either way you answer, you're not going to end up looking good. So I have an example here from a movie, Moonrise Kingdom.
tell Mom or Dad. I will replace the batteries when I return. Signed, Susie Bishop.
Where the hell are you? Does it concern you that your daughter has just run away from home?
That's a loaded question.
Come down and read this.
Okay. Does it concern you that your daughter's run away from home? And Bill Murray says, that's a loaded question. It's a loaded question because embedded within the question is the assumption that the daughter has run away from home. So first, that needs to be established before the question is asked, does it concern you that your daughter's run away from home? So that would be a complex question, and it's fallacious. First, you need to establish the fact that the daughter's run away from home. Then you need to establish the fact that of whether or not it concerns you. Okay, so here in complex question, you're making assumptions that you're not warranted in making. Okay, then we have appeal to ignorance. This is an argument built on a position of ignorance, claiming either that a statement must be true because it has not been proven to be false, or a statement must be false because it has not been proven to be true. In either way, it's a fallacy. So to assume that a statement must be true because it has not been proven to be false, you're neglecting a couple of options. One, just because it's not been proven to be false, it doesn't mean that it's not false, right? So rather than believe that it's false or believe that it's true, maybe you should withhold judgment here. And then with the second one, a statement must be false because it has not been proven to be true. Again, just because it hasn't been proven to be true doesn't mean it's not true. So simply because something's not been proven to be true doesn't mean you should believe that it's false. Okay, let's look at the first one again. A statement must be true because it has not been proven to be false. Here's an example. There must be intelligent life on other planets. No one has proven that there isn't life on other planets. Okay, so just because we haven't proven that there's not, it doesn't mean that there is, right? And of course we haven't proven that there's not. We've only investigated a small portion of the universe, and maybe there's intelligent life out there, but it doesn't warrant the assumption that there is because no one has proven that there isn't. And it goes the other way around too. A statement must be false because it has not been proven to be true. That's an unwarranted assumption. Here's an example. There isn't intelligent life on other planets. We've searched and searched and we found nothing. Okay. So, just because we've searched and searched and we found nothing, it doesn't mean it warrants the conclusion that there isn't life on other planets. Now, the universe is large and we've only searched and searched a small area, and maybe there's intelligent life outside of that area. So that's appeal to ignorance, but not all arguments that argue from the lack of evidence are bad arguments. So you can argue from the lack of evidence to a positive conclusion. Here's sort of the structure of such an argument. We may argue that if X were true, we should see or discover Y. We don't see Y, therefore X probably isn't true. So if X were true, we should see or discover Y. And we don't see Y, therefore X probably isn't true. So you might say this: after all these years, we haven't found evidence of bears living in Las Vegas. Thus, there probably aren't bears living in Las Vegas. So if it were true that there were bears living in Las Vegas, it'd be something that you'd expect to see or discover. There are 2 million people here. We're kind of taking up most of this basin. If there were bears around, we'd see them. Somebody would see them. And that's the sort of thing you'd expect to be reported to the news. I just saw a bear. It's wandering, it's wandering down the strip or something like that. Yeah, so if there were bears in Vegas, you'd expect to see them. Since we don't see them, then there probably aren't bears. And, if that doesn't convince you because you're like, well, Vegas is huge, and maybe someone's hiding a bear, you can just narrow the sort of area that you're considering. So you might say, I haven't found any evidence of bears living in my home. Thus, there probably aren't bears living in my home. So if it were true that a bear was living in your home, then you would expect to see or discover the bear living in your home. Since you don't see a bear living in your home, there probably isn't one. So not all arguments that argue from the lack of evidence to a positive conclusion, not all of them are bad. Here, this takes discernment, background knowledge, and context to be able to determine whether a fallacy is in fact committed, whether the assumption is unwarranted. So, just to give you an idea, if you're thinking about extraterrestrial life and you're thinking about the expanse of the universe, you're looking for something very small in a very large area. But if you're looking for a bear in your home, you're talking about something very big relative to the area, that you're investigating. So you can see that in the one case, in the case of extraterrestrial life, it's not warranted to say, to argue from ignorance. But in the other case, it is okay to argue from ignorance. Okay, then we have another fallacy, appeal to unqualified authority. This is an effort to persuade by appealing to the opinions of people who have no expertise, training, or knowledge relevant to the issue at hand. Okay, so my dad, he's a plumber, and he's an expert plumber. He's been a plumber for years. But he doesn't know anything about physics, and neither do I, for that matter. But suppose that I went over to his house and I said, "Hey, Dad, how's it going?" And he said, "Hey, how's it going, son? You know that old Stephen Hawking guy? Like, yeah, the world's foremost physicist. Yeah, I know who he is. Well, that guy's full of it." And I'm like, "What? Stephen Hawking? He's full of it?" And my dad's like, "Yeah, Stephen Hawking's totally full of it. He says there aren't, and he says there are such things as black holes. Has he ever been to a black hole? No. Then how would he know there are such things?" All right. So my dad is an expert plumber, but he's no expert on physics. And here he's making a claim about physics, and he's making a claim about a physicist that he doesn't know what he's talking about. That the physicist, he's claiming the physicist doesn't know what he's talking about. So my dad's making a mistake here, and I would be making a mistake to trust my dad in this case, because he has no expertise, training, or knowledge relevant to the issue at hand, whether or not there are black holes. Stephen Hawking, on the other hand, does. So if I went to you and I appealed, to my dad's expertise, or lack thereof, on physics, and said, "Hey, you know what? My dad says there are no such things as black holes, and that Stephen Hawking is full of it. Therefore, there are no such things as black holes, and Stephen Hawking is full of it." Okay, so that would be an appeal to an unqualified authority. So this whole story was a sort of, big setup to show you an example of an appeal to an unqualified authority. If I'm appealing to my dad for claims in physics, then I'm appealing to an unqualified authority because he's a plumber, not a physicist. Now, if I appeal to Stephen Hawking, that's okay. He's a qualified authority when it comes to physics. If I'm appealing to him about the nature of black holes and such. Okay. So here is a video of Tom Cruise claiming that psychiatry is a pseudoscience, and then we'll see someone with the quote below committing a fallacy of unqualified authority based on this interview.
Coming up, the mood changes a bit. You're going to see a fiery Tom Cruise talk about his attack on Brooke Shields, antidepressants, and Ritalin for kids. I've never agreed with psychiatry, ever. Before I was a Scientologist, I never agreed with psychiatry, and then when I started studying the history of psychiatry, I started realizing more and more why I didn't agree with psychiatry. And as far as the Brooke Shields thing is, look, But you gotta understand, I really care about Brooke Shields.
Alright, so it's a short clip, but, here's Tom Cruise is saying, psychiatry, we shouldn't trust it, kind of thing. So you have someone who says, Tom Cruise says that psychiatry is a pseudoscience, so there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance, and people should stop taking antidepressants. Tom said so. Okay, so you're appealing to Tom Cruise as an authority on whether or not psychiatry is a pseudoscience. This is an appeal to an unqualified authority because although Tom Cruise may be a great method actor or something, he's not necessarily an expert on psychiatry. So to appeal to him to say that psychiatry is a pseudoscience would be to appeal to an unqualified authority. This isn't rational. So what you need to do is you need to look at people who actually are experts on psychiatry to determine whether, it is a science. And you can even look into to psychiatry itself, the claims it makes, its sort of methods, and things like that. Now, there's an interesting sort of caveat here, though. Like, just because Tom Cruise said it, and he has no expertise, it doesn't mean that what he said is false. He could be absolutely right about psychiatry, that it's a pseudoscience. And so we shouldn't just dismiss his claims because he's an actor and not a psychiatrist. On the other hand, we shouldn't just accept them because he's an actor and not a psychiatrist. Okay, so two things. You shouldn't just accept what he says on his authority because he's not an authority on psychiatry. That would be the appeal to unqualified authority. On the other hand, you shouldn't just dismiss what he says because he's not an authority. That would be argument against the person. Simply because he's not an authority, it doesn't mean that what he says is false. But simply because he says it, it doesn't mean it's true. Okay, so I guess what you need to do is look into the issue yourself rather than to appeal to Tom Cruise. Not that any of you would be appealing to Tom Cruise. Okay, we should also note that some appeals to authority are not fallacious. Some appeals to authority are not fallacious. Like I said, if you're appealing to Stephen Hawking to talk about the nature of black holes, well, then you've done a rational thing there. Stephen Hawking is the world's expert on black holes, or so I think. He's done a lot of pioneering work in this area. The fact of the matter is that we all rely on authority for our information. Google Maps, teachers, scientists, etc. Consider the claim water is H2O. My guess is that not many of you have actually proven that water is H2O, that if you believe it because your teacher told you or you read it in a chemistry textbook. Well, that's relying on an authority for your information. And it's not unreasonable. We can't get around, in the world without relying on authorities. Like, knowledge is sort of a social group effort. But the problem comes in when you are appealing to someone in order to believe something when that someone is no authority on the thing you're trying to believe, or that you're coming to believe. Okay, so some appeals to authority are not fallacious, but some are. When you appeal to an unqualified authority, it's fallacious. When you appeal to a qualified authority, it's not fallacious. But there are standards. There are standards for when appealing to an authority to support a claim is appropriate. And this will help you determine. Okay, how do we determine whether someone is an authority? The subject must be one in which there can be an authority. The subject must be one in which there can be an authority. All right, so maybe there can't be an authority on what the stock market is going to do next month, right? So to appeal to Smith, the economist, or whatever, I don't mean Adam Smith, I just mean random Smith. Let's say Jones. Jones, the economist. To appeal to Jones, the economist, and say, Jones, the economist, says that in a month from now the stock market is going to do such and such. Well, I don't know. I'm no economist. Maybe there can be an authority on that. Maybe there can't be. I'm not sure. But the subject must be one in which there can be an authority. So like a chemist is an authority on whether or not water is H2O. So yes, there can be authorities in chemistry. Okay. 2. The opinion cited must fall within the authority's area of expertise. The opinion cited must fall within the authority's area of expertise. So even if you're an authority, it doesn't mean that you're an authority on everything. You probably know a whole lot about a very little area, and then for the rest of the world, you're just like everyone else. So let's take Richard Dawkins. He's a brilliant biologist at Oxford. He knows a whole lot about biology, but for a lot of other stuff, he's just like me and you. He's not an expert. He's knows something, but you shouldn't appeal to him as an expert. You should appeal to him as an expert for biology, but not necessarily for any other area for which he's not an expert. So take this example. Richard Dawkins is a brilliant biologist at Oxford. I have heard him say that there are no good arguments for God's existence, so there probably aren't. All right, so look, just because he's a brilliant biologist, it doesn't mean that you should listen to him when he says there are no good arguments for God's existence. You can't just appeal to his authority as a biologist to substantiate the claim that there are no good arguments for God's existence. Why? Because just because he's an expert on biology, it doesn't mean he's an expert on God or religion or philosophy. Okay. What you would need to do is appeal to some philosopher or religion or religious studies expert regarding the arguments for or against God's existence. Then again, you're better off just checking out the arguments for yourself, right? Okay, so just because you're an expert in one area doesn't mean you're an expert in all areas. So the opinion cited, in order for the appeal to authority to be good, the opinion cited by the authority must fall within the authority's area of expertise. So Richard Dawkins claiming something about biology, you're on good grounds. 3. The authority must be trustworthy and reliable. So if you've established that someone's an authority on biology, let's move away from biology so you don't think I'm talking about Richard Dawkins. If you've established that someone's an authority on physics, but you've also established that they're a pathological liar, well, then you shouldn't trust them. Or if they're a supposed authority on physics, and then you find out that they're saying all sorts of wrong things about very basic matters in physics, then you could say, okay, they're not trustworthy when it comes to physics, right? So those are some of 3 ways in which you can establish that someone is an authority. Okay, now it might be confusing to you, how to distinguish between argument against the person and requiring an authority to be reliable. Aren't we making an argument against the person when we say, oh, you just appealed to him, but he doesn't have any expertise in this area? I mean, after all, in a previous lecture, I gave an example that was very similar to that, where Obama said, last time I checked, Sarah Palin wasn't an expert on nuclear issues, right? And I called that an argument against the person. Okay, so why is it okay? Why is it rational to require an authority to be reliable? Why does that not commit the fallacy of argument against the person? Well, there's a difference between these 2 things. With argument against the person, and now I'm right here, the unreliability of the person is irrelevant to whether or not the claim should be accepted. So take the Obama-Palin example. Whether or not she's an expert on nuclear issues, that's irrelevant to whether or not her current proposal is any good, right? So her unreliability on nuclear issues, in terms of not being an authority, that doesn't matter because we just need to look at the proposal she put forward. We need to examine the proposal for itself rather than just dismiss it because she's not an expert. On this side of things, when you're requiring an authority to be reliable, the unreliability of the person is relevant to whether or not he counts as an authority on a particular matter. Okay, so if someone says they're an expert on physics, but they're making all sorts of basic errors when it comes to claims about physics. They've just established themselves as unreliable when it comes to physics. Okay, so requiring an authority to be reliable when it comes to matters of which they're speaking, that's relevant to whether or not you can trust them, right? So it's not argument against the person. Now let's look at the second row, I guess. Since unreliability of the person is irrelevant, it's fallacious to reject the claim based on the unreliability. So, with the Sarah Palin example, since her lack of authority on nuclear issues is irrelevant to whether her current proposal is any good, it's fallacious to reject her claim simply because she's not an expert. On this side, it's not fallacious to reject the person's authority to make claims on a particular matter. Okay? It's not fallacious to reject the person's authority to make claims on a particular matter. So you see that they're making all sorts of mistakes when it comes to basic physics. Then you know they're not reliable when it comes to making claims about physics. Okay, here's an example of argument against a person. John says that the earth is round. He can't be right about that. After all, he cheats on his wife. Okay. Yeah, obviously, whether or not John cheats on his wife, I mean, that's irrelevant to whether or not the earth is round. You shouldn't just say, oh, the earth can't be round because John cheats on his wife. It's like saying, say what? You know, those things have nothing to do with each other. So the issue is relevance. See the key word, relevance. Relevance. The unreliability of the person is either relevant or irrelevant to whether or not you should accept their claims. Okay, here's an example on the other side. I wouldn't trust what John says about quantum mechanics. Every time he's made a claim about quantum mechanics, he's been wrong. Okay, now you can see that your attack on his person, that he makes claims about quantum mechanics that are wrong, and he does it all the time, that's relevant to whether or not you should trust what he says about quantum mechanics. Okay, finally, we've got false dichotomy. This is a fallacy that occurs when it is assumed that only two choices are possible, when in fact other choices exist. So you're presenting only two options, and you're presenting it as these are the options. You can't, there's no third, there's no fourth, but in fact, they're not the only logically possible choices. Other choices exist. So you might have a daughter or a son, or you might have been someone like this yourself who said to his parents, either you let me go to the concert or I'll die, right? Okay, so those aren't really the only two options. Like, maybe you don't go to the concert and you're sad for a day or two and then you live. Surprise, surprise, right? So maybe you don't go to the concert and you're perfectly fine. Okay, so there are many other options besides going to the concert or dying, right? And so I actually have a funny example from Stephen Colbert on false dichotomy.
Thank you for taking time between taxing and spending to talk to me. Congressman Barney, can I call you Frank?
It'd be my best name. You can say whatever you want.
President Bush. Great president or the greatest president?
Keep going.
Well, there's only two options I've got. Thank you.
Oh, I think he's been a disaster.
Well, I'll put you down for great, because obviously you don't think he's the greatest. Because it's the lower of the two, and obviously you don't think he's the greatest president. So I'll just put you down for it. Bush is great. President Frank. 22nd September.
Alright, so what you have going on there is Stephen Colbert presents Barney Frank with only two options regarding President Bush, and obviously Barney Frank, being a Democrat, doesn't like those two options. You know, President Bush is either a great president or he's the greatest president. Alright, so there's another option that he's an okay president, another option that he's the worst president, right? Another option that he's a terrible president but not the worst. So presenting I mean, Stephen Colbert did it for comedic effect, but presenting just two options as if these are the only two possible options, it's called a false dichotomy. So you're making an unwarranted assumption that these are the only possible options.